So, within the context of mobile communication, all the communication between your device and a server in the rest of the world, it happens through the access network. So, like the access network provides the first hop of connectivity. So, it's like how your mobile is directly connected to the rest of the infrastructure. In the context of 5G and mobile communication, this access to the infrastructure is mostly provided by the RAN, the radio access network. So in a 5G RAN, it's basically all the infrastructure which you need so that your mobile can connect via radio to the rest of the world. And there is a lot of things behind that, and most of them are not visible. So but if you look to a cell tower, or for example, with a building with some infrastructure on top of it, you may be seeing something like this. You have some larger structures, typically at least in three different directions. Those are the so-called sectors, so like you have sectorized antennas, and you may have some other equipment which is connected to that, which is actually, for example, giving the amplification of the signal. And you may have beyond that also some large cabinet which stands there near such towers. So this is a very typical deployment, but there is a very wide range of possibilities of deployment today and different types of equipment in the market. You may see some larger towers as shown here, but you may also see some very small equipment which looks more like Wi-Fi access points, but also provide access to the 5G network. So it's very important to understand the concept of cellular networks. That's how mobile communication is done nowadays. So basically, you don't try to have the coverage of all your system with a single transmitter. Instead, what you have is that you divide the coverage into smaller pieces, as shown here on the left, and these pieces are called cells. So in essence, you transmit with less power and then you can reuse. In each cell, you can have more capacity. So like you reuse the resources so that you can make multiple transmissions, one on each cell at the same time, at the same frequency, and in different spatial resources. As it's shown here on the left, typically you have a sectorized deployment so that actually your cells mostly correspond to sectors and the frequencies that you have in these sectors. And there are many, many ways, and this is getting every day more complex, actually, how you plan and develop a cellular network. You can have not only cells in multiple frequencies, you can have, for example, a single piece of equipment controlling multiple towers and a very large number of cells, as is shown on the right side. This is what's called the centralized run. So, and it's becoming more and more popular that you have this, at least for the baseband processing, that you have this pooling of resources so that you can do a lot of processing for a very large area. So when we talk about cellular networks, it's important also to understand that you have this division of coverage with the cell, but it's very difficult actually to identify cells. And you need to plan very carefully, and each type of equipment and system, they may actually signal and define cells in a slightly different way. With 5G, it was also defined a new air interface, and that's called 5G NR. NR stands for new radio. So NR is actually then a radio access technology introduced for the fifth generation. Let's understand the main characteristics and how it played out. So first of all, this was standardized by 3GPP starting at release 15, and the evolution of this technology also started throughout the releases after that. We need to understand also that 5G has brought many advancements, but in many, many similar ways is a technology which is very similar to 4G LTE. So it's like not really reinventing the wheel. Many of the characteristics and procedures are actually reused and perhaps slightly enhanced compared to the 4G LTE. And that, in a sense, actually may create some confusion because a lot of people had the expectation that 5G brings something much better to the picture, but actually, in many points of the technology, it behaves pretty much the same as 4G LTE. Well, one of the benefits that it brought compared to 4G is actually the introduction of new bands, and in particular, the use of the millimeter wave bands and the C band or mid band. And while millimeter waves are really not that widespread, the C band is actually what forms today this new capacity. So like Whereas in 4G LTE, it was common, for example, to have FDD bands with 20 megahertz. Now we can have in this mid band quite often bands up to 100 megahertz, which can provide some higher peak data rates, and in conjunction to the other bands actually provides enough capacity that we need for our daily use of smartphones. Another characteristic which is quite different in 5G NR compared to 4G LTE is that it has extreme flexibility. So you can really configure and reconfigure every piece of signal, every piece of channel that you would have there in the radio access interface. And while that lets you to have so many different ways of implementing and deploying, that also has a downside to it, which is complexity. So it's a bit difficult to understand the whole concept of all 5G possibilities. One characteristic is actually that 5G NR was planned for a gradual deployment. So what you have most out there on the field still today is what's the so-called 5G non-standalone. So when you have NSA non-standalone configuration, in essence, it means that you can only deploy 5G on top of 4G. So you need a working 4G system, which is then enhanced to actually signal that you have cells which are capable also of transmitting 5G signals. That's 5G non-standalone. And while it brings higher capacity and higher peak data rates, to a great extent, it works pretty much as a 4G because it's an extension of the 4G system. And on top of that, another characteristic was that it was planned to have a dynamic spectrum share with 4G. So like in the very beginning, when 5G was being introduced, you have pretty much only 4G phones and very few new 5G capable phones. And yet you can use the capacity and drive this capacity mostly to 4G. And over the time, as you get more 5G capable phones, then actually you can use the same spectrum and have the capacity more to 5G. That's very different from other generations. Like when you had older generations and had to make the transition, it had to be a bit more hard and static settings, which needed a lot of effort from the operators. With dynamic spectrum sharing and 4G NSA, actually 5G was introduced in a very smooth way. Another important point, and here it's like one of the core aspects of 5G technology, is that uses beamforming to have a larger reach. So like we can say that 5G really took to a totally different level, like the amount of antennas that you can have to deploy your radio access network, and you can do a lot of beamforming and a lot of multiple antennas processing to have more capacity. And this really helps to reuse the same towers and locations, even though you're going to a higher frequency, which has more problems of propagation. With beamforming, you can to a certain extent recover the coverage that you would have otherwise lost. And then you can still operate the 5G technology in the same towers and locations which already have a 4G network. That's very, very important for the operators so that they can leverage the investment. It's very difficult to get new locations and to commission them, to get all the licenses, to get the leases and everything which is needed to bring it to operation. So reusing towers and location is an essential feature which has also helped for gradual deployment.